So, big picture theme we're going to see multiple times throughout this course is how we maintain homeostasis. And early on here, it's really about glucose homeostasis. So, we're going to be focusing on this slide on what happens when you have high blood sugar levels and then what happens when you have low blood sugar levels. So to orient you first with kind of what we're talking about here, I'm going to go through the middle section of this slide here. So this is going to be talking about what is the molecule, gland, or enzyme that we're going to be discussing that helps to fix high blood sugar or low blood sugar situations. So the first thing we need to involve is the pancreas and say, what is the pancreas secreting and what does that indicating in terms of the state that we're in, need state or fed state? We'll then address adenylate cyclase. So AC is again adenylate cyclase. And adenylate cyclase is responsible for synthesizing cyclic AMP. From that point on, we'll go on and we'll say, what is the state of pKa, knowing that cyclic AMP is a regulator of pKa activity. So is pKa active or inhibited? And we'll actually on this slide go through those important structural details to highlight how or why an enzyme is active or inhibited. And then we'll talk about in this phosphorylation cascade, phosphorylase kinase and then phosphorylase. Now remember, the two arms of our sort of glycogen metabolism substrate cycle have to do with whether phosphorylase is active and we're breaking down glycogen in a need state, or synthase is active and we're activating glycogen synthesis in a fed state. So at the end of the day, and we're going to go through the low blood glucose, the need state first, at some point, that need state will not only be remedied, but you're likely to be in a fed state because you'll have eaten. So how do we switch then from this need state to a fed state? Again, we've got a lot of kinase activity, a lot of phosphates being added, and that's often done by a master phosphorylator like pKa. So then we're going to have a master dephosphorylator. So remembering that PP1 is going to be a master dephosphorylator. Okay, so that's what PP1 is a master dephosphorylator. Let's go ahead and just add this up here. pKa is again a master phosphorylator. Okay. So one other small piece just to kind of highlight here is we have this PP1 inhibitor, which we're going to refer to as a fail-safe. So oftentimes when you have something really important that has to happen, maybe 1, 2, or even 3 things need to be checked off to ensure that if you're making the decision to do that, you really want to be doing that. And so this PP1 inhibitor is going to be a situation that is going to ensure that if we are undecorating kind of all of our phosphate decorating, that we really want to be doing that. And if we don't want to be undecorating our phosphates, that we inhibit PP1. Oh gosh, so even all that was just a lot already. I want to make sure we're going to be talking about some structural details here. There's another video that kind of goes through this slide, and this slide I love because it has some of those structural pieces. Okay, we even go in further on this slide and highlighting, the importance of calcium here in terms of phosphorylase kinase, specifically where these phosphates are added as we've discussed them. 3 other videos that you might consider watching are the structural details of the videos for pKa, phosphorylase kinase, and phosphorylase. Those are 3 enzymes that we've taken a deep dive on their structures to understand how that structure affords function. Okay, you ready? So let's talk about what happens when we have a low blood glucose level. Okay, first thing we need to think about is the pancreas is going to recognize that that's the situation and it's going to increase the production of glucagon. And again, that puts us in a need state. So highlighting up on top here, low blood sugar is a need state. Remembering when we use that word need state, we're specifically referring to the need for glucose or the need for energy, because depending on sort of the metabolic pathway we might be talking about, they might be helping and fixing with different sort of scenarios though. So energy or glucose need state. All right, so what happens then is we've got this glucagon activating signal. It's going to interact and ultimately activate adenylate cyclase. So adenylate cyclase is going to be activated, and that's going to increase cyclic AMP levels. Okay, now that we know that cyclic AMP has been increased, that means that we are going to be activating pKa. So pKa is again going to be activated. I'm going to put this in green here, anything that we're going to have to talk about activating. So pKa is going to be active, and we're going to talk about the structural details very briefly with just some key words here, but to jog your memory about how this enzyme works. Remember, pKa is going to be active when those regulatory subunits are bound to the cyclic AMP, okay? And then that's going to free those two catalytic subunits to be able to go on and do their phosphorylating chemistry. Okay, so I'm going to go through the rest of the cascade here, and then we'll kind of highlight in a second who actually does that phosphorylating, okay? But we're going to be phosphorylating here, phosphorylase kinase. So I'm going to be adding a phosphate there. So when we add a phosphate, just putting some details there, that phosphate is going to be added to the alpha and the beta subunits. Remember, phosphorylase kinase is that tetrameric protein where all four pieces stay together, but we're going to have the alpha and the beta subunits get phosphorylated. And then we're also going to need to add calcium to that delta subunit, and that is going to make the gamma subunit active. Wow, I know there's a lot there. If you need to go back and watch the phosphorylase kinase video to see all of those structural details, please go ahead and do that. Okay. Now, if we are in this need state arm, the next thing that's going to happen is we are going to be phosphorylating. Let me get my red pen here. We're going to be adding a phosphate, specifically to phosphorylase. Okay, so phosphorylase is going to be the one that's getting a phosphate there. I'll talk about in just a moment who's doing that phosphorylating. Okay, but what we have is that phosphate is going to go on to that serine 14. Okay, and this is going to have our N terminus not be buried. Our N terminus is going to be outside. And remember, it's going to be locked in place by those critical arginine residues. So I'm going to just put arginine residues there. That's reminding us that we're going to have those residues lock it into that R state. And again, we're going to have phosphorylase now be active. So phosphorylase is going to be active. Okay, let's talk about sort of the other pieces here that have to do with the dephosphoryl or the sort of the fed state sort of arm here. But we also are going to have a phosphate that's added onto synthase. Okay, and we're going to talk about what that means. We really didn't talk too much about the structural details of this protein. Okay, but when we add a phosphate to synthase, this is going to make it inactive. Okay. And when we are in a need state, we are actually going to be adding 2 phosphates to PP1. So I'm going to show 2 phosphates here. Okay, we talked a little bit about the structural details here of PP1, but when it's doubly phosphorylated, that means it's going to be inactive. Okay, we're also going to have a phosphate being added to the PP1 inhibitor. Okay, so this is almost like it's a double negative. The PP1 inhibitor gets phosphorylated, but this actually makes it active, okay, so that it's going to bind to and inhibit PP1. So let me put this in green here just so that we can kind of keep consistent with our colors here. So PP1 inhibitor is going to be active. And what that means is it binds to and inhibits PP1. Okay, so logic checks are always going to be something we do here. If we are doing all of this work with these kinases to be adding phosphates to things, we do not want to have a master dephosphorylator going around and undoing that. So how do we make sure this fail-safe does that? Well, the inhibitor for PP1 is active when it is phosphorylated. Okay? So at the end of the day, we need to be able to connect a upstream sort of signal, low blood sugar, to what we need to do to fix that. And so here's sort of the fix. because we've got phosphorylase being active. And I'm going to kind of draw an arrow down here with this. Because this is active, we are going to break down glycogen. And again, we've talked about that pathway. We break it down first to G1P, then to G6P. If we're talking about this happening in the liver, G6Pase is going to make that into free glucose, and only free glucose can be exported from the liver using a GLUT2 receptor. Ooh, if that was something that was still kind of confusing, make sure to go back and watch some videos on glycogen breakdown. And then also there'll be a video on looking at the differences between skeletal muscle and liver cells in terms of how they manage this need state. But again, if we're talking about low blood sugar, what's going to be helping here is the liver, not skeletal muscle. So we're going to break down glycogen to remedy that low blood glucose level. All right, oh my gosh, I know there's so much on this slide, but it's a great way to sort of summarize all of your knowledge from here. The last thing I want to point out is pKa is this master phosphorylator. So let's talk about, for all of these phosphates that we see being added, who has that been done, or pKa has done that to which ones? Sorry. So we're going to have pKa phosphorylating phosphorylase kinase, right? Now, phosphorylase kinase is who phosphorylates phosphorylase. So changing color here, phosphorylase kinase is who is going to phosphorylate phosphorylase, okay? But all of these other phosphorylation steps happen with pKa. Okay, so all of those phosphates, all of those phosphorylation steps are happening by pKa with the exception of phosphorylase kinase, right? And we know that from our phrase we've been saying for a long time, pKa phosphorylates phosphorylase kinase, phosphorylase kinase phosphorylates phosphorylase, phosphorylase phosphorylizes glycogen to break it down into glucose and remedy a low blood sugar level. Wow. Okay, done with half of this slide. Let's go over to the other side and let's talk about what's similar, what's different, what's complementary when you talk about being in a fed state. So it might be easy too to think about imagining we just were in a need state and maybe we were tapping into our glycogen reserves for a little bit, but then we finally ate some food, right? So we ate some food, and so that kind of put us not into the fixed blood glucose level, but into a high blood glucose level. We're now in a fed state. So let's again walk through these different scenarios and ask what's happening. Well, we know now that the pancreas is going to increase its production of insulin. Insulin, again, being a fed state hormone, okay? That means we are going to be inhibiting cyclic AMP and lowering, inhibiting adenylate cyclase and lowering cyclic AMP levels, okay? So we are going to inhibit adenylate cyclase, which means we are going to drop cyclic AMP levels. Okay, so what this means now for pKa, it is going to be inhibited. And let's remember structurally why that is, because those catalytic subunits are now going to be tied up with the regulatory subunits. Remember, the regulatory subunit is like a competitive inhibitor for the catalytic subunit. It binds to and puts an inhibitory domain in the active site of the catalytic subunit, and so the catalytic subunit cannot do its chemistry. Okay, so it is inhibited. But if we're also going to talk about making sure that everybody else who's part of that cascade to break down glycogen is also inhibited, we need to snip off those phosphates. So we've inhibited pKa, so it's not doing any decorating, but the stuff that already was decorated, we need to undecorate. Okay, we need to remove phosphates from other things. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we remove phosphates from phosphorylase kinase. Okay, so removing phosphates from phosphorylase kinase means we're removing from the alpha and those beta regulatory subunits. We're likely to have a drop in calcium levels, okay, which means that gamma subunit is now going to be inactive. Okay, so that's what happens with phosphorylase kinase. Now, for phosphorylase, we are also going to be snipping off of a phosphate from that serine 14. Okay, when we snip that phosphate off that serine 14, now we can bury that N-terminus, okay? That locks it into the R state. We also are going to be snipping a phosphate off of synthase. So snipping a phosphate off of synthase, and we have no structural details that we studied on this enzyme, but that's okay. That is going to make synthase active. So synthase is going to be active, okay? And I'm just going to highlight here that we've got no structural, I can't spell today, no structural details. So don't worry about that for synthase. We really didn't understand how or why it's activated or inhibited other than understanding that it's subject to covalent modification. So adding a phosphate to synthase inhibits it. Removing a phosphate from synthase activates it. Okay, last two pieces to kind of put into place here is when we think about PP1. Now, this is going to be a little bit, this is the one thing that's like a little bit weird, okay? We are actually going to be adding a phosphate, but a single phosphate to PP1, okay? Adding a single phosphate to PP1 makes it active. Now, here's where, even if that doesn't make sense, you're like, wait, Dr. Perenni, like a kind, like we're doing phosphorylating for a fed state, but this is with an insulin stimulated protein kinase. So this is an insulin stimulated protein kinase. So the logic check is still there. It's a kinase that's active in the presence of insulin. We're not going to see a ton of these. Our umbrella of D-phospho-phospho is going to work for the majority of what we need to understand. So if PP1 just has one phosphate, it's going to be active, but that phosphate is added by kinase that's active in the presence of insulin. So that logic check makes sense. We've got high blood sugar, we've got high insulin levels. We want PP1 to be putting us into that D-phospho state, okay? So thinking about what also is going to be important here is thinking about this dephosphorylation that has to happen of the PP1 inhibitor. This is the double negative piece. So this is going to make this guy inactive. Okay, and this sort of makes sense. So again, this is our double negative. Okay, so the PP1 inhibitor is inactive. And if the inhibitor is inactivated, it doesn't inhibit PP1. So PP1 is still active because the inhibitor is not doing its inhibition. Okay, that was a lot. One more little arrow to put on here to finish this out. Remember, we need to be able to connect sort of our situation here with fed state, high glucose. How do we help remedy that? Well, one of the ways that you help remedy that is in the liver, and this happens in the muscles too, but we're specifically talking here about liver, is we want to be pulling in that glucose. It's going to come in through GLUT2 because it's higher concentration outside than in. And once it gets inside the liver, we're going to have active synthase doing its job, synthesizing glycogen. And that's a way to pull in that glucose from the bloodstream and then be able to make sure that we are helping to lower blood sugar by storing it as glycogen. One last little piece here, because we identified who was sort of a substrate for pKa, which is a master phosphorylator, let's just go ahead and identify for this master dephosphorylator for PP1, who is that responsible for sort of snipping phosphates off of? And actually, all four of what we see here are going to be snipped off by PP1. So going ahead, I know I've got already a ton of arrows on here already, right? But PP1, that master phosphorylator, is going to snip it off of the PP1 inhibitor to make sure that it's not inhibiting PP1. It's going to snip it off of synthase and make sure that it's active. It's going to snip it off of phosphorylase and make sure that it is inactive. And actually, we didn't actually write that here. So let's make sure to write that in here, that when we snip that phosphate off of serine 14 and we bury that N-terminus, that makes this guy inactive. Okay, and the last piece is we also snip it off of phosphorylase kinase. So all 4 of those dephosphorylation events are happening by PP1, phosphoprotein phosphatase 1. Wow, a ton that is there, but this is a great slide. I promise you, you might need to watch it a couple of times to get all of these pieces from need state, fed state, low blood sugar, high blood sugar, in terms of being able to think about how all of these pieces fit together.